In this video, we will cover how some Nilo-Saharans ended up in southern Africa, which was home to primarily the San and the Proto-Bantu. I would like to emphasize that history has parts we will like and others we will not like, and we have to put everything on the table so we can all be better. I had a comment alluding to this content leaning towards being anti-Nilo-Saharan. It isn't. Holding us all accountable isn't anti-anyone. When toxicity spills over, it negatively affects everyone, and we need to understand where we can all be better. So the Nilo-Saharans are found almost everywhere in Africa, and it is important to understand how and why this happened. In the modern iteration following the movements of Nilo-Saharan people, we can start from approximately 600 BCE, when Islamic conquest across Africa was starting to spread. I think at some point we will have to go all the way back to the Kingdom of Kerma and before that, but for now we will focus on the more Arab influence. An early recorded event of more Arab Nilo-Saharan cooperation is recorded by the Portuguese priests, who were themselves rather problematic. Actually, they were very problematic, extremely problematic. They wrote about the Sultan of Mogadishu at the time enlisting the Gala, who would later become the Oromo. I have to point out that the word Gala, like the word Hottentot, which are words found across historical records, are not used anymore. They are derogatory words, and I only use them here to create a link to the population that they're referring to today. And after I say the word, I will not say it again. So in this case, they are referring to the Oromo. So the historical record shows how the Sultan of Mogadishu enlisted the Oromo to attack the Christian Emperor of Ethiopia. And guess who was instigating this event? The Portuguese priests. The Portuguese were annoyed at the Christian emperor and promised him that his kingdom would fall to an attack. And it did. This event shows that the Portuguese had influence in the region's affairs and that they maintained a relationship with the groups that they felt could advance their interests in Africa, and oftentimes these groups were of Nilo-Saharan origin. The Portuguese seem to have valued the ability of the nomadic raider herders, and this may have been driven by their own experience at the hands of Muzimba. Now notice how he has a Bantu-derived name and not Nilo-Saharan, and this is where it becomes very important to understand the historical context and look into the culture of the people and critically analyze what you're reading. Even though Muzimba had a Bantu-derived name, he was still practicing Nilo-Saharan culture, and we are what we do. So he was identifying, one can say, as Nilo-Saharan. This is because at this point, they were Nilo-Saharans who had assimilated into the Proto-Bantu groups or assimilated some Proto-Bantu into their own groups and adopted some of their language elements, which tends to happen when women are abducted and forced to assimilate into the raiding group. The language tends to become a mix, and the children that result from these abductions tend to carry names from their maternal group and speak a mixed language. That becomes a representation of this new group's history. This often happens unless the father is highborn and the child is raised by their paternal grandmother, or rather influenced mainly by their paternal grandmother. Culture across many societies is often carried by women, and when women adopt cultural elements of their abductors to keep the peace, they still use their language with their children, who learn to speak a mix of both their father and mother's languages, which over generations becomes its own distinct language, and that's probably how Bechuana or the Sotho-Tswana languages emerged. Another example of a new language emerging is from the Khoi, who spoke Dutch, or rather a Cape version of Dutch, which is not as similar as the Dutch spoken in the Netherlands, because their first Khoi grandmothers spoke Khoi and broken Dutch, which they passed on to their children, who identified as Dutch. And here's a quote of the event that motivated the relationship between the Portuguese and Muzimba. He attempted a silent retreat, but Muzimba fell upon the Portuguese unexpectedly and cut to pieces the rear guard, killing the commander who had flown to render them assistance. On this occasion, they lost likewise Father Nicolas de Rosario, a monk of the San Domingo, who was tortured to death. Muzimba put on the monk's frock and, carrying the chalice in his hand, marched at the head of the troops, who each bore a limb of the Portuguese, which they ate at a feast to honor their victory. This took place in 1592. The Portuguese seem to have found this useful, and later allied with Muzimba, making him their man, which may have contributed to the surge of the Nilo-Saharan population in southern Africa in places that had a Portuguese presence. They also seem to target the Sudanic people like the Mbuti, who shaved their teeth, which was a common practice among these groups that came into southern Africa. The Portuguese seem to have adopted the policy of hiring Nilo-Saharan Sudanic mercenaries from the Moor and Arabs, which explains why and how the Nilo-Saharans and Sudanic people are found almost everywhere in Africa there was Portuguese or Moorish Arab presence, and later in British-controlled territories, because the British simply copied and pasted these policies. The Portuguese, Moors, Arabs, and British seem to have resettled their mercenaries close to the places they had invaded. So, in Southeast Africa, they were resettled in what the Portuguese would later call Delagoa Bay, because this is where the British described them as being native too. But we know this area was part of the Proto-Bantu kingdom, and those in it should have been Proto-Bantu and speaking the Proto-Bantu language, but they were not. Delagoa Bay is significant because it is close to the Sofala area. Sofala is the first place the Portuguese stole from the Moorish Arabs, who stole it from the Proto-Bantu. These natives of Delagoa Bay, as described by the British, were speaking Bechuana, or the Sotho-Tswana language, not Proto-Bantu. Delagoa Bay was also home to Shaka's grandfather, who was known to be the biggest terror of them all and a favorite of the Portuguese, which might explain why Shaga's father was under control of the Natal region, and Shaga kept up trade with the Portuguese at Delagoa Bay, a fact history often tends to ignore, and this may explain why the British initially had to court Shaga from the Portuguese. We can see evidence of Shaga's ancestry tracing back to Delagoa Bay and tied to the Moor Arabs because of the use of the word Baba for father. Since words like this rarely change, it gives us an idea about the culture and the identity of the people using the word. The presence of the word Mulungu for God or white person is another clue that needs accounting, because this is used by Nyanja-speaking people and some populations in Uganda who use this word for God. The Bechuana use Tate. The Nkosa still use the Proto-Bantu Tata, say Utata. So Baba or Baba is also the Moorish Arabic word for father, and since the Portuguese were usurping the Moorish Arabs, it seems likely they mixed 2 or 3 or more Nilo-Saharan populations that had come in at different times, one with the Moorish Arabs and the next with the Portuguese. There is also evidence of a Nilo-Saharan population who appear post 1100 BC or AD at Great Zimbabwe. They differ from the prior populations, and they used cow dung to build their homes, and their culture was slightly different, and evidence shows that they seem to have integrated some of the original population, who were Proto-Bantu, Khoi, and San people. This new population at the time was called Zanj by Arab writers, and they are said to have usurped the original first population, and this is how we learn that the Zanj weren't Proto-Bantu, but a Nilo-Saharan population from their cultural practices. In the next part of this series, we will go over the reason the British created the Mfecane. I hope you liked this video and found it useful. If you did, please like and subscribe. Thank you so much to all the people that have supported this channel by giving to our coffee. We really appreciate it. It goes a long way to making this content and this research possible.